The eviction notice gave Carter Hayes 48 hours to clear out of the apartment he'd shared with his 7-year-old son, 48 hours to figure out where they'd sleep when landlords required deposits he didn't have and shelters separated families. His bank account showed negative $32 from overdraft fees, his truck had a quarter tank of gas, and his phone would be shut off in 3 days when the bill he couldn't pay came due. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Carter sat in the apartment complex parking lot with the notice in his hand and his son Lucas asleep in the passenger seat, both of them processing the fact that 2 years of barely surviving since his wife died had finally collapsed into actual homelessness. He'd worked construction when he could find it, had done landscaping and roofing in any labor that paid cash, but steady work was scarce in rural North Carolina for men without credentials or connections. His wife's medical bills from the cancer that killed her had bankrupted them even with insurance, had left him with debt that garnished wages and destroyed credit. The county foreclosure auction list had been a desperate scroll through his phone, looking for anything cheap enough that his last paycheck might cover. Most properties went for thousands, abandoned houses needing gutting, commercial buildings requiring permits he couldn't afford. But there, listed at minimum bid, was something that caught his attention through sheer impossibility of the price. Riverside Tobacco Barn. 4 acres. Minimum bid $465. Structurally unsound, no utilities, sold as is for demolition or salvage. Carter had driven past tobacco barns his whole life, massive wooden structures built in the early 1900s when tobacco was currency and fortunes were made curing leaf in vast drying sheds. Most had fallen to decay or been torn down when smoking rates dropped and tobacco farming became unprofitable. The ones that survived were usually preserved as historical landmarks or converted to event venues by people with money for restoration. This one was different. The auction photos showed a building that should have collapsed years ago, walls leaning at impossible angles, roof sagging in the middle, windows long gone, weathered wood turned gray from decades of neglect. The land it sat on was overgrown with kudzu and scrub brush, inaccessible except through a barely visible dirt road. No one in their right mind would want it. But Carter wasn't looking for right mind real estate. He was looking for 4 walls and a roof, for somewhere Lucas could sleep that wasn't a shelter or the truck, for any option that didn't involve explaining to a 7-year-old why they were homeless 2 years after watching his mother die. The auction happened on a Tuesday morning at the county courthouse, a room full of investors and developers bidding on properties they'd flip for profit. Carter stood in the back holding the $465 in cash he'd scraped together from his final paycheck, praying no one else wanted a condemned tobacco barn badly enough to bid against him. The auctioneer moved through properties quickly, each one drawing multiple bids that drove prices into thousands. When Riverside Tobacco Barn came up, the auctioneer's tone suggested he was fulfilling legal requirements rather than expecting actual interest. 4 acres with tobacco barn built 1897. Structure condemned, no utilities, access limited. Buyer responsible for all back taxes and any demolition costs. Minimum bid $465. Do I have $465? Carter raised his hand, feeling every eye in the room turn toward him with expressions ranging from curiosity to pity. No one else bid. The auctioneer called it twice more, got no response, brought the gavel down. Sold for $465 to bidder 42. See the clerk for paperwork. Just like that, Carter owned property. Condemned, worthless, inaccessible property, but property nonetheless. A place where he and Lucas could sleep without asking permission, without facing eviction, without depending on systems that couldn't help families like theirs. The drive to the tobacco barn took them down roads that got progressively worse, pavement giving way to gravel giving way to dirt barely wide enough for the truck. The property sat at the end of a lane that hadn't been maintained in years, hidden from the main road by forest that had reclaimed what had probably once been cleared fields. When the barn came into view through the trees, Lucas pressed against the window with an expression Carter couldn't quite read. "Is that ours?" Lucas asked quietly. "Yeah, buddy. That's ours." The barn was worse in person than the auction photos suggested. Easily 100 feet long and 40 feet wide, 3 stories tall with a roof that looked ready to collapse under its own weight. The wood siding showed gaps where boards had fallen off, the foundation was crumbling fieldstone, the massive sliding door hung crooked on rusted rails. Kudzu covered one entire side, creeping up walls and threatening to pull the structure down through sheer vegetative weight. But it was standing, and it was theirs, and that was more than Carter had owned 24 hours ago. They approached carefully, Carter testing each step before letting Lucas follow. The interior was a cathedral of decay, massive timbers that had once supported tobacco hanging racks still visible in the framework, floors covered in debris and bird droppings, light streaming through gaps in the walls creating patterns that shifted with the wind. The smell was earth and rot in time, the atmosphere oppressive with abandonment. "It's scary," Lucas said, his voice small in the vast space. "It's old and it needs work. But it's got good bones, solid timber. Your great-grandfather built houses like this back in the day, they made things to last, used heart pine that got harder with age." Carter ran his hand along one of the main support beams, feeling wood that was still solid despite decades of weather. "We can make this work." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They spent the afternoon exploring, Carter assessing what was salvageable and what was dangerous. The first floor was mostly open, the traditional tobacco barn layout designed for maximum air circulation during curing. The second and third floors were accessible by a staircase that looked questionable, platforms where tobacco had once hung to dry. Everything was covered in years of accumulation, old farming equipment, broken furniture someone had stored and abandoned, remnants of a life and industry that had moved on. It was on the first floor, in a corner obscured by fallen boards and debris, that Carter found something that didn't fit the pattern of abandonment. A section of the floor where the boards looked newer than the rest, where someone had made repairs that the rest of the barn hadn't received. He cleared away debris, finding boards that could be lifted rather than nailed down. Beneath them was a stone staircase descending into darkness. Carter's construction experience told him this wasn't original to the barn, wasn't part of tobacco storage. Someone had excavated beneath the building, had created a cellar that the barn concealed. He went to the truck for a flashlight, told Lucas to stay upstairs, then descended stone steps worn smooth by use that suggested decades of traffic. The cellar was maybe 20 feet square, stone walls expertly mortared, the ceiling supported by timber beams that matched the barn's construction. The air was cool and dry, the space clearly designed for long-term storage. But what stopped Carter's breath wasn't the construction quality, it was what the cellar contained. Wooden crates stacked along one wall, each marked with dates ranging from 1897 to 1963. Metal containers that looked like safe deposit boxes. A heavy wooden chest bound with iron straps. And on a small table in the center of the room, covered in dust but clearly visible, a handwritten note weighted down with a glass paperweight. Carter approached the table carefully, picked up the note, read words that had been waiting in darkness for however long since they were written. "To whoever finds this room, everything here belongs to the Riverside property. It's been hidden for reasons that died with me, protected from banks and government and family who'd have wasted it. Use it wisely or sell it carefully. But know that every dollar came from tobacco and the sweat of people who worked these fields when tobacco was king. Don't dishonor that labor by being careless with what it produced." Thomas Whitmore, 1963. Carter stood in the cellar holding a note from a man who'd been dead for probably 60 years, trying to process the implications of crates and containers in a chest that suggested someone had hidden wealth beneath a tobacco barn. His hands shook as he set the note down, approached the nearest crate, used a crowbar he'd brought from the truck to pry it open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and preserved against moisture, were bundles of currency. Old bills, some dating to the 1920s and 30s, denominations ranging from ones to hundreds. He opened another crate, found more money, different years, all carefully preserved. A third crate held gold coins, $20 pieces and eagles, dates ranging across decades. The metal containers held bonds and stock certificates, legal documents and property deeds, paperwork documenting the financial operations of what had clearly been a substantial tobacco farming operation. The heavy chest, when Carter finally managed to open it, contained more gold, bars stamped with dates and weights, investment-grade bullion that someone had accumulated over years. Carter sat on the cellar floor trying to comprehend what he'd found, trying to reconcile the fact that he'd bought a condemned building for $465 and discovered what looked like a fortune hidden in its foundation. The amount was impossible to calculate without proper evaluation, but even conservative estimates suggested hundreds of thousands, maybe millions in currency and precious metals and financial instruments. His first thought was Lucas sleeping in the truck upstairs, was the eviction notice and negative bank balance and the desperate circumstances that had brought them here. His second thought was that wealth this substantial didn't stay hidden in abandoned barns unless someone had reasons for concealing it, unless there were complications that went beyond simple inheritance. He climbed back upstairs, found Lucas exactly where he'd left him, innocent and unaware that their circumstances had potentially changed from homeless to wealthy in the time it took to descend stone stairs. Carter's military training from his brief service before Lucas was born kicked in: document everything, secure the location, tell no one until you understood what you had and who might want it. That evening, camping in the barn with sleeping bags Carter had bought with the last of his cash, he researched Thomas Whitmore on his phone's dying battery. The name appeared in historical records of North Carolina tobacco farming, mentions in books about the industry's golden age, references to Riverside Tobacco Company operating from 1897 to 1963. Thomas Whitmore had been the last owner, had closed operations when smoking rates began declining, had died in 1964 at age 76. But there was something else in the records, a note about disputed inheritance, about family conflicts over the estate, about property that was eventually sold at auction for back taxes after years of legal battles left no clear heir. The barn and land had changed hands multiple times over 60 years, each owner unable to make tobacco farming profitable, each eventually abandoning the property to foreclosure. None of them had found the cellar. Or if they had, they'd kept it secret for reasons Carter didn't understand yet. His phone finally died around midnight, leaving them in darkness that was complete and profound in ways city apartments never achieved. Lucas slept peacefully in his sleeping bag, exhausted from the day's changes, unaware of the discovery that might transform everything. Carter lay awake listening to the barn creak in the wind, feeling the weight of choices that would define what came next. The cellar waited beneath them, holding secrets that had rested for 60 years, that represented either salvation or complication depending on who else knew about them and what claims they might make. The tobacco barn stood in darkness surrounded by forest that had reclaimed fields, holding within its decaying walls the accumulated wealth of 3 generations who'd built fortunes from crop that was now mostly historical curiosity. By morning, Carter would need to make decisions about what to do with his discovery, who to trust with information about finding wealth in a condemned building, how to transform desperate purchase into actual security. But for tonight, he let himself feel the impossible relief of owning something, of having shelter and potential, of discovering that the gamble born from desperation had led somewhere that might actually save them. The barn breathed in the darkness, its timbers settling with sounds like whispered conversation, its hidden cellar keeping watch over treasure that had survived economic collapse and family feuds and 60 years of abandonment. Carter closed his eyes and allowed himself to hope for the first time in 2 years that things might actually work out, that the place he'd bought as last resort might become the foundation for rebuilding a life that cancer and debt had destroyed. Tomorrow would bring complications he couldn't anticipate. But tonight, in the silence of a tobacco barn that shouldn't have been standing, holding secrets it shouldn't have protected, Carter Hayes slept knowing that he and his son were no longer homeless, that they owned something no one could take from them, that the impossible had happened and now he had to figure out what to do with the gift or burden or both that $465 had purchased. Carter spent the first morning documenting everything in the cellar with his phone's camera before the battery died completely, photographing each crate, each container, the note from Thomas Whitmore, the layout of the space itself. His construction background had taught him that disputes were won through documentation, that proving what you found and when you found it mattered when questions of ownership arose. He was on his 3rd crate inventory when he heard a vehicle approaching through the overgrown lane. Carter climbed the stairs quickly, emerged into the barn to find Lucas looking worried near the entrance. A black SUV had pulled up outside, expensive and out of place in the rural decay. Two men emerged, both wearing business casual that marked them as not from around here. The older man, maybe 60 with silver hair and the posture of someone used to being obeyed, approached the barn's entrance without waiting for invitation. "You must be the person who bought this property yesterday." "I'm Douglas Whitmore. This barn and the land it sits on have been in my family since 1897. I'm here to make you an offer you'll want to consider seriously." Carter positioned himself between the men and Lucas, every instinct from his brief military service triggering alert status. "The property sold at public auction. It's mine legally." "Legally, yes. But there are complications you're not aware of, family claims that predate the foreclosure process." Douglas pulled out a business card identifying him as owner of Whitmore Holdings LLC. "My great-grandfather Thomas built this barn, ran the tobacco operation here for 66 years. When he died, his estate was mishandled by incompetent executors, the property sold for taxes it shouldn't have owed. My family has been tracking ownership for decades, waiting for the right moment to reclaim what should never have been lost. Then you should have bid at the auction. We didn't know it was being auctioned until after the sale completed. County notifications are sometimes delayed." Douglas's tone suggested the delays weren't accidental. "I'm prepared to offer you $5,000 for the property. That's a substantial profit on your $465 investment." Carter felt the calculation in the offer, the assumption that someone desperate enough to buy a condemned barn would jump at quick money. "The property's not for sale." The younger man spoke for the first time, Douglas's son based on the family resemblance. "Mr. Hayes, you bought a building that's structurally unsound, on land you can't access properly, with back taxes and potential environmental lanes you haven't discovered yet. Our offer represents a clean exit from complications you're not equipped to handle." "What complications specifically?" "The property has outstanding tax assessments from when it was farmland. The barn itself is condemned, which means you're liable if anyone gets hurt on the property. There are environmental regulations about tobacco barns and potential chemical contamination from pesticides used in historical operations." The younger Whitmore, he hadn't introduced himself, spoke with the practiced ease of someone who'd delivered similar warnings before. "Taking our offer saves you from months of legal expenses defending ownership against claims you don't have resources to fight." Carter processed this, recognizing the same pressure tactics he'd seen in construction: create fear about complications, make selling seem easier than standing ground. "I'll take my chances with the complications." Douglas's friendly demeanor hardened. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be. This property has sentimental value to my family that goes beyond money. We're offering you a generous settlement for something you bought on a whim. Refusing that offer suggests you're either stubborn or you've found something that makes you think the property is worth more than it appears." The shift in tone was barely perceptible but unmistakable, from making an offer to probing for information. Carter kept his expression neutral, aware that admitting he'd found the cellar would change the entire dynamic. "I bought property I could afford. What I do with it is my business." "Fair enough. But understand that family claims on disputed estates can take years to resolve, can make your ownership complicated in ways that affect your ability to use or sell the property." Douglas handed Carter his card. "Think about our offer. $5,000 for a condemned barn is generous. Rejecting it means choosing expensive legal battles over practical solutions." After they left, Carter stood in the barn doorway watching dust settle on the lane, feeling the weight of threats wrapped in business language. Lucas emerged from where he'd been hiding behind a support beam, his 7-year-old face showing fear he was trying to hide. "Are they going to take our barn?" Lucas asked quietly. "No, buddy. The barn is ours. They're just people who wish they'd bought it first, trying to scare us into selling cheap." Carter pulled Lucas close, feeling his son's small frame against him, feeling the responsibility of decisions that would shape what came next. "But we need help figuring out what we actually own and who has legitimate claims on it." He drove to the county clerk's office that afternoon, Lucas waiting in the truck while Carter requested property records. What he found confirmed Douglas Whitmore's story but added complications. Thomas Whitmore had died in 1964, his estate had been probated, but the proceedings showed family disputes over the will's validity. Multiple Whitmore descendants had filed claims, each asserting they were the rightful heir. The legal battle had lasted 8 years, during which property taxes accumulated until the county finally foreclosed and sold the barn at auction in 1972. Since then, the property had changed hands 6 times. Each owner had held it briefly, a few years at most, before abandoning it to foreclosure when they couldn't make tobacco farming profitable or afford the taxes on agricultural land. The most recent owner had held it for 3 years before the county seized it again for back taxes, leading to the auction where Carter had bought it. None of the records mentioned a cellar or hidden assets. The property was described simply as tobacco barn and land, valued at minimal amounts that reflected its condemned status. Carter also requested death certificates and estate documents for Thomas Whitmore, finding a will that had been contested by at least 4 different family members. The will itself was straightforward. It left everything to Thomas's grandson Marcus, specifically excluding Thomas's son Douglas Sr. for reasons the will didn't explain beyond knowing that he would waste what 3 generations built. But Marcus Whitmore had died in Vietnam in 1966, 2 years after Thomas. With Marcus dead and no other heirs named in the will, the estate had fallen into the legal chaos that eventually led to foreclosure. Douglas Whitmore, the man who'd visited the barn, was Thomas's great-grandson through the son who'd been specifically excluded from the will. His claim to the property rested on being family rather than being designated heir, on arguing that Thomas's decision to exclude his son shouldn't have affected subsequent generations. Carter left the clerk's office understanding he'd inherited not just property but a family feud that had been frozen for 60 years, waiting for someone to discover what Thomas Whitmore had hidden. The seller's wealth explained why Thomas had excluded his son, why he'd hidden assets instead of distributing them through normal inheritance, why someone had gone to such lengths to keep wealth away from family members he didn't trust. That evening, Carter drove to a law office in the county seat, a small practice run by a woman named Helen Martinez who'd been recommended by the clerk as someone who handled property disputes. Helen was maybe 50, carried herself with the worn professionalism of someone who'd spent decades fighting battles for clients who couldn't afford big firm rates. "I bought a tobacco barn at foreclosure auction," Carter began after explaining his situation. "The family who originally owned it showed up the next day wanting to buy it back. I need to know if they have legitimate legal claims that could challenge my ownership." Helen pulled up property records on her computer, reviewed the history Carter had already seen. The Whitmore family dispute is legendary in county legal circles. Thomas Whitmore specifically excluded his son from inheritance, which the son contested unsuccessfully. The grandson who did inherit died before he could take possession. The estate was tied up for years before the county finally foreclosed for back taxes. She looked at Carter directly. "Your ownership is clear legally. You bought at a properly noticed public auction, you paid the amount bid, you have a valid deed. No Whitmore descendant can challenge that ownership based on family connection alone." But they're claiming there were problems with how the estate was handled. They've been claiming that for 60 years. Courts have repeatedly ruled that the foreclosure was proper, that the family had opportunities to pay back taxes and didn't, that subsequent sales at auction were legitimate. Unless they can prove actual fraud in the foreclosure process, which they haven't been able to do in 6 decades, their claims have no merit. Carter felt some relief, but Helen's expression suggested there was more. "What am I missing?" "Legal clarity doesn't prevent harassment. If the Whitmores want this property badly enough, they can file nuisance lawsuits, challenge your title through expensive litigation, make your ownership complicated even if they have no chance of winning. That strategy works against people who can't afford to defend clear ownership rights." She paused. "Why do they want to condemn tobacco barns so badly?" "Most family property disputes are about houses with sentimental value or land worth developing. A falling down barn shouldn't generate this kind of interest." Carter made a decision in that moment, trusting instinct that said Helen needed to know what she was actually defending. "I found something in the barn. A hidden cellar with what looks like substantial assets, currency, gold, financial documents dating back to the 1890s. There was a note from Thomas Whitmore saying everything belonged to the property. Helen's expression sharpened with understanding. That explains the pressure. They don't just want the property, they want whatever Thomas hid to keep it away from family he didn't trust. She pulled out a legal pad, started taking notes. We need to document everything you found, establish that your discovery happened after you took legal ownership, secure the assets properly, and be prepared for the Whitmores to escalate dramatically when they realize you're not selling. Over the next week, Helen helped Carter navigate complications he hadn't anticipated. The currency in gold needed professional authentication to establish value and legitimacy. The bonds and stock certificates required research to determine if they were still valid or had matured decades ago. The entire discovery needed documentation that would stand up to legal challenges about ownership and finders' rights. They found a numismatist in Raleigh who specialized in historical currency, a man named Robert Chen who'd worked with estate discoveries before. Robert drove to the barn on a Saturday, descended into the cellar with the careful reverence of someone who understood they were witnessing history. "This is remarkable," Robert said, examining the currency with gloved hands. "You have bills here dating to the 1920s, some rare denominations, condition ranging from good to exceptional. The gold coins alone are worth significant money, $20 gold pieces from the early 1900s, St. Gaudens double eagles, coins that collectors pay premiums for." He worked methodically through several crates before looking at Carter with an expression mixing excitement and concern. "Conservative estimate, you're looking at $2 to $3 million in currency in gold. That's not counting the bonds or other financial instruments." Carter sat on the cellar floor processing numbers that seemed impossible, that transformed his desperate barn purchase into wealth that could change everything for him and Lucas. "How do I convert this to actual money without creating problems?" "Very carefully. Currency this old needs to be sold through proper channels, auction houses, legitimate coin dealers, established buyers who can verify authenticity and provide documentation of purchase. The gold is more straightforward but still requires professional sales to avoid tax issues." Robert paused. "You also need to understand that wealth like this doesn't stay secret. Once you start selling, word will get out. People will know you found something valuable, and that knowledge creates its own complications." Those complications arrived faster than Carter anticipated. 2 days after Robert's evaluation, Douglas Whitmore appeared at the barn again, this time with lawyers. They brought documents asserting family claims to any assets found on the property, arguing that Thomas Whitmore's hidden wealth should have been distributed through his estate rather than concealed from legitimate heirs. Helen met them at the barn, her presence shifting the dynamic from intimidation to legal proceeding. "Your family claims were litigated 60 years ago. Thomas Whitmore had the right to dispose of his property however he chose. He chose to hide assets on land that was later sold at public auction. My client bought that land legally and discovered those assets after taking ownership. They belonged to him." The lead Whitmore attorney, a man in his 40s with the polished aggression of corporate law, responded with prepared arguments. Thomas Whitmore's decision to conceal assets constitutes fraud against his estate. Had the executors known about this wealth, it would have been distributed according to intestate succession laws after his designated heir died. The family members who should have inherited have been deprived of their rightful property for 6 decades. Thomas Whitmore left a note specifically stating the assets belonged to the property. That's clear documentation of intent. He wanted whoever owned the land to have what he'd hidden. Your clients could have bought the property at any of the 6 foreclosure auctions over the past 50 years. They chose not to. They don't get to claim assets they deliberately didn't pursue. The argument continued for an hour, lawyers speaking in legal language that obscured the simple truth. The Whitmores wanted wealth they believed should have been theirs, and Carter stood between them and that wealth. Eventually they left, but not before the corporate lawyer delivered a clear threat. "We'll be filing suit to freeze the assets pending proper estate resolution. Your client won't be able to sell or move anything from that cellar until courts determine rightful ownership. That process will take years and cost more money than a construction worker has access to. Our family can outlast him financially. Make him understand that reality." After they left, Helen was quiet for a long moment before speaking. They're going to make this expensive and complicated. They'll file injunctions, request hearings, demand asset appraisals, drag you through legal processes designed to exhaust your resources. Even if you win eventually, the fight will cost tens of thousands in legal fees. Can we win? Yes. Your ownership is clear, Thomas's intent is documented, the family had 60 years to claim this property and didn't. But winning requires surviving the legal battle long enough to get to a courtroom where facts matter more than resources. She met Carter's eyes directly. I can work on contingency, percentage of the asset value when we prevail. But you need to be prepared for months of pressure, for them to make your life difficult in ways that are technically legal but designed to force settlement. That night, Carter sat with Lucas in the barn they'd been living in for 2 weeks, both of them eating dinner from cans heated on a camp stove. Lucas had adapted to their circumstances with the resilience of children, had made a game of camping in the barn, had shown more stability in 2 weeks of poverty than he'd had in 2 years of struggling to maintain apartment living. Are the bad people going to take the treasure? Lucas asked, his voice carrying the directness of 7-year-old questions that cut through adult complexities. They're going to try. But the treasure belongs to us because we own the barn and the man who hid it said it should belong to whoever owned the property. Carter pulled Lucas close, both of them sitting on sleeping bags in a building that was barely standing, holding wealth that should have been impossible but was real. Sometimes people who have money think that means they can take things from people who don't. We're going to show them that's not how it works. Mom used to say you're stubborn like a mule when you decide something's right. The mention of his wife hit Carter harder than the Whitmores' legal threats, brought back memories of her final months, of hospitals and treatments and the slow recognition that medicine couldn't save her, that he was going to lose the person who'd made his life make sense. She'd died believing Carter would be okay, would raise Lucas well, would survive the grief and debt and chaos her death left behind. He hadn't survived well. Had barely survived at all. But finding the barn and the cellar had given him something she'd wanted for him, a chance to build security that didn't depend on employers who could fire him or landlords who could evict him. The Whitmores threatening that chance felt like threatening her final hope for them. Yeah, Carter said quietly. I'm stubborn when it matters. And this matters. Over the following month, the legal battle escalated exactly as Helen predicted. The Whitmores filed injunctions attempting to freeze the assets, requested court-ordered appraisals, demanded Carter provide detailed inventories of everything in the cellar. Each filing required response, required hours of Helen's time, required documentation and legal arguments that consumed resources Carter didn't have. The county newspaper picked up the story, ran an article about the family who'd been fighting over tobacco wealth for 60 years, about the single father who'd bought a condemned barn and found a fortune. The publicity brought unexpected support, locals who remembered the Whitmores' reputation for aggressive business practices, who resented wealthy families pressuring working people, who contributed to a legal defense fund that helped cover Helen's costs. But the publicity also brought complications. The IRS contacted Carter about potential tax liability on found assets. The State Historical Society wanted to examine the cellar and document the tobacco-era artifacts. Insurance companies demanded he secure the property properly or face liability if anyone was injured. Every new involvement created additional costs and requirements that accumulated faster than Carter could address them. Through all of it, Douglas Whitmore made regular visits, each time raising his offer. 5,000 became 10,000 became 20,000, each increase accompanied by warnings about legal costs and complications that would consume whatever Carter eventually won. You're fighting over principle, Douglas said during one visit, his tone mixing frustration and something approaching respect. I understand that impulse. Thomas was the same way, stubborn to the point of self-destruction. But principle doesn't feed your son or keep roofs over heads. $20,000 is real money for a construction worker. Take it and build a life instead of fighting battles you're not equipped for. Your great-grandfather specifically excluded your grandfather from inheritance because he knew the family would waste what he'd built. I'm not going to dishonor that choice by handing you wealth he spent his final years hiding from people like you. The words hit harder than Carter intended, brought Douglas up short with the recognition that Carter had researched the family history, understood the dynamics that had led to Thomas's decisions. Douglas's expression shifted from frustration to something colder. Thomas died alone and bitter because his stubbornness isolated him from everyone who mattered. The grandson he trusted got killed in a war that didn't matter. The wealth he accumulated sat in darkness for 60 years while family who could have benefited from it struggled and failed and died broke. That's what principle got him, nothing. Don't make the same mistake. After Douglas left, Carter sat in the barn holding his son, both of them processing the truth in words that were meant to threaten but revealed something else. Thomas Whitmore had chosen to hide wealth rather than see it wasted, had died believing his choice was right even if it meant dying alone. Carter understood that choice in ways Douglas couldn't. Sometimes protecting what mattered required sacrifices that looked like failure until enough time passed to see their full impact. The cellar waited beneath them in darkness, holding secrets that had rested for 60 years, that represented either salvation or complication depending on whether Carter had the strength to stand against people who'd spent generations perfecting the art of taking what they wanted through legal pressure and patient intimidation. The barn creaked in evening wind, its timbers settling with the weight of age and secrets, its condemned status no longer matching its purpose as shelter for a father and son who'd found in its decay the resources to rebuild lives that medical debt and grief had destroyed. Carter committed himself to fighting battles he didn't fully understand for reasons that went deeper than money into the realm of honoring trust placed in whoever was desperate enough to discover what Thomas Whitmore had died protecting. The legal battle stretched across 8 months, a grinding process of filings and hearings and depositions that consumed Carter's energy and Helen's billable hours. The judge assigned to the case was a woman in her 60s who'd presided over property disputes for 30 years, who'd heard variations of this argument countless times, family claiming moral rights to property they'd lost through their own inaction. The turning point came during a hearing where Douglas Whitmore's lawyers presented their case for why Thomas's hidden assets should be considered part of his estate rather than property fixtures. Helen countered with Thomas's note, with property law establishing that fixtures belonged to land, with documentation showing the Whitmore family had been notified of every foreclosure auction and had chosen not to participate. The judge listened to both sides, reviewed the extensive documentation, then delivered a ruling that was both legally precise and morally clear. Thomas Whitmore had the right to dispose of his property as he saw fit. He chose to exclude certain family members from inheritance, which is his prerogative regardless of whether subsequent generations agree with that choice. He had assets on property that later sold at public auction after his designated heir died and the estate failed to pay taxes. Mr. Hayes purchased that property legally, discovered those assets after taking ownership, and has clear title to everything the property contains. She paused, looking directly at Douglas Whitmore. Your family has spent 60 years claiming you were wronged by Thomas's decisions. But being excluded from an inheritance isn't being wronged, it's experiencing the consequences of behavior that made a property owner decide you couldn't be trusted with what he'd built. This court will not override Thomas Whitmore's explicitly stated wishes to benefit family members he specifically chose to exclude. The ruling was comprehensive, denying all Whitmore claims, establishing Carter's ownership of the cellar contents, and awarding him legal fees to be paid by the Whitmores for filing frivolous claims. Douglas and his lawyers left the courtroom in silence, their 60-year pursuit of family wealth finally and definitively ended. But victory brought its own complications. The publicity from the case had attracted attention Carter hadn't wanted, from treasure hunters who believed there might be more hidden on the property, from con artists offering schemes to maximize the asset's value, from distant Whitmore relatives who hadn't been involved in the lawsuit but who contacted Carter with sob stories about deserving inheritance. More importantly, converting the discovery into actual security required navigating systems that were designed for people with resources Carter didn't have. Selling the currency in gold through legitimate channels meant working with auction houses that took substantial commissions, meant paying taxes on found assets that consumed nearly 40% of the total value, meant hiring accountants and tax attorneys who charged rates that made Helen's fees look modest. Robert Chin helped connect Carter with reputable buyers, ensured the sales were documented properly, guided him through the process of transforming historical currency into modern money. The final settlement, after all taxes and fees and legal costs, left Carter with just over $1 million, substantially less than the initial estimates but more money than he'd ever imagined having. Helen advised him carefully about how to protect and invest it, connected him with financial advisors who worked with sudden wealth clients, helped him establish trusts that would ensure Lucas's education and future were secured regardless of Carter's choices. But she also warned him about the psychological impact of sudden wealth, about how money changed relationships and created expectations that were hard to navigate. "You're going to have people come out of nowhere claiming you owe them something," Helen said during one of their final meetings. "Distant family, old friends, people who helped you once and now think that help earned them a share of your fortune. You need to decide now what your principles are about sharing wealth, because every decision you make will be judged by people who think they know better." Carter had already experienced some of that pressure. Lucas's maternal grandparents, who'd been absent since their daughter's death, suddenly wanted to be involved in their grandson's life now that Carter had money. Former co-workers who'd never offered help when he was desperate now had investment opportunities or business ideas they wanted him to fund. Even the community support that had been genuine during the legal battle started including people whose motives were less pure. But there were also unexpected sources of wisdom. Margaret Brennan, an elderly woman who'd worked for the Whitmore tobacco operation in the 1950s, visited Carter one afternoon with stories about Thomas that added context to the choices that had shaped everything. "Thomas was a hard man but a fair one," Margaret said, sitting in the barn that Carter had started renovating with a portion of his settlement. "He paid better wages than other tobacco farmers, treated workers with respect when most treated them like equipment. But he had no patience for waste or laziness, couldn't stand seeing people squander opportunities or resources." His son Douglas Sr., the current Douglas's grandfather, he was everything Thomas hated. Spent money on status symbols, made bad investments trying to look successful rather than actually building value, treated workers poorly because he thought being the boss's son earned him that right. Thomas tried to teach him different, but Douglas Sr. just resented the criticism. Margaret paused, looking at the barn's massive timbers that Carter was carefully preserving. "When Thomas wrote his will leaving everything to his grandson Marcus, he told me it was because Marcus understood that wealth was a tool, not a trophy. Marcus worked the tobacco fields himself, learned the business from ground level up, showed the kind of character that deserved inheritance. Then Marcus got drafted, went to Vietnam, and died in some valley whose name Thomas couldn't even pronounce correctly. That broke something in Thomas. He'd spent his life building security for family, only to have the one person he trusted killed in a war he didn't believe in, leaving wealth that would go to people he knew would waste it. So he hid it, wrote that note, and died alone believing he'd at least prevented the wrong people from getting what he'd built." The story helped Carter understand the weight of the trust Thomas had placed in whoever found the cellar, the hope that someone worthy would discover it and use it better than excluded family members would have. That understanding shaped how Carter approached the money and the property. He established a foundation using a portion of the settlement, funding it to provide housing assistance for families facing eviction, to help single parents dealing with medical debt, to support the kind of desperate circumstances he'd experienced before finding the barn. The foundation operated quietly, without publicity, honoring the same discretion Thomas had valued. The barn itself became a project that consumed Carter's construction expertise and his need to build something meaningful. He stabilized the structure carefully, preserving as much original material as possible while making it safe and functional. The tobacco curing racks were restored as historical elements, the massive sliding doors repaired and rehung, the hand-hewn timbers cleaned and sealed to last another century. But he also made it livable. The first floor became a workshop and community space, available for local craftspeople and small businesses that needed affordable work areas. The second floor was converted to a modest apartment where he and Lucas actually lived, surrounded by history but with modern utilities and safety features. The third floor remained largely original, preserved as a reminder of what the building had been. The cellar, once emptied of its hidden wealth, became a climate-controlled archive housing Thomas Whitmore's business records and Margaret's donated materials documenting tobacco farming's golden age. Schools brought students to learn about agricultural history, about economic forces that shaped rural communities, about the human stories behind industries that had defined regions before dying away. Lucas thrived in ways that constant moving and poverty hadn't allowed. He attended the local school, made friends who came to the barn for sleepovers in a building that felt like adventure to children who didn't know it had been condemned. He helped Carter with renovation projects, learned carpentry and problem-solving, developed the kind of practical competence that came from working with his hands on things that mattered. The transformation took 3 years, during which Carter discovered he'd built something beyond just shelter. He'd created a community resource that honored Thomas's legacy while serving present needs. The barn stood as proof that buildings could have second lives, that preservation and function weren't mutually exclusive, that wealth used thoughtfully created more value than wealth simply accumulated. Douglas Whitmore appeared one afternoon during the barn's 3rd year of renovation, arriving without lawyers or threats, carrying himself with the diminished energy of someone who'd accepted defeat. He was 75 now, moved slower, wore the expression of a man reckoning with choices that had shaped his life. "I wanted to see what you've done with the place," Douglas said, looking at the restored barn that bore little resemblance to the condemned structure he'd tried to reclaim. Wanted to understand what Thomas saw that was worth hiding from family. Carter showed him through the building, explained the community workshop spaces and the historical archive and the apartment where he and Lucas lived. Douglas walked slowly, taking in the restoration work, the preserved timber, the careful balance between honoring history and creating utility. "Thomas would have approved of this," Douglas said finally, his voice carrying something between regret and acceptance. "He always said buildings should serve purposes beyond just standing, that resources should create value rather than just represent it. I spent 60 years fighting over money I thought I deserved, and you spent 3 years building something that actually matters." They sat in the workshop area, 2 men shaped by Thomas Whitmore's choices in very different ways, finally talking honestly about inheritance and legacy. "My grandfather cut my father out of his will because he saw traits he couldn't tolerate being rewarded," Douglas said. Waste, entitlement, the belief that being family meant deserving wealth regardless of character. "I inherited those same traits, spent my life trying to acquire what Thomas had denied us, never questioning whether he'd been right to exclude us. But watching you fight for this property, seeing what you've built with resources Thomas hid, it made me reckon with whether I actually deserved inheritance or just wanted it because being excluded felt like being judged inadequate." Douglas paused. Thomas was judging us inadequate. And he was right. The admission hung in the air between them, honest in ways that legal battles had never allowed. Carter felt unexpected sympathy for a man who'd spent his life pursuing validation through acquisition, who'd finally reached an age where he could see his own mistakes clearly enough to acknowledge them. "I'm sorry for the pressure we put on you," Douglas continued. "For the lawsuits and the threats and the attempts to make you surrender through exhaustion. You were right to stand your ground, to honor Thomas's intentions. I'm glad someone did what we should have done, built something meaningful instead of just fighting over ownership." After Douglas left, Carter stood in the barn thinking about inheritance and the ways families passed down both wisdom and damage across generations. Thomas had excluded his son, had hidden wealth to prevent waste, had died alone trusting that someone worthy would eventually find what he'd protected. Douglas had spent 60 years proving Thomas's judgment correct, had pursued money that was never rightfully his, had finally achieved the clarity that came too late to change the past but could at least inform the present. Margaret Brennan passed away in the barn's 4th year at 93, her funeral held in the community space she'd helped create through her donations and stories. She'd spent her final years teaching Lucas about tobacco farming, about the workers who'd made the industry function, about the complicated man who'd employed her and who'd shaped so much of the county's history through his stubborn principles. "Thomas would be proud of what you've built here," Margaret had told Carter during one of their last conversations. "He spent his life protecting resources from people who'd waste them, died believing his precautions had failed when Marcus was killed. Knowing that someone eventually used those resources properly, that would have given him peace he didn't have when he died." The foundation Carter had established grew beyond his initial vision, helped 37 families over 5 years, prevented evictions and medical bankruptcies for people who were experiencing the same desperation that had brought him to the foreclosure auction. The work operated through referrals from social workers and community organizations, deliberately avoided publicity that would attract people gaming the system for free money. Lucas asked questions about it as he got older, wanted to understand why his father gave away substantial portions of the settlement when they could have lived more comfortably keeping it all. Carter explained it through the lens of Thomas's note, through the recognition that wealth came with obligations to use it in ways that honored how it was earned. The money we found came from tobacco, from an industry built on hard labor by people who worked fields in heat that would kill you if you weren't careful, Carter said one evening while they worked on the barn's final renovation projects. Thomas made his fortune paying those workers fairly, treating them with respect other operations didn't show. Using his money to help people who are struggling, that honors the labor that created the wealth in the first place. On a warm evening in late spring, 7 years after Carter had bought the barn at auction, they held what had become an annual tradition. The Riverside Heritage Celebration, a day when the barn opened to the community, when families who'd been helped by the foundation shared their stories, when students displayed projects about tobacco history and agricultural economics. Carter watched Lucas, now 14, give tours of the archive to groups of younger students, explaining the business records and photographs with the competence of someone who'd grown up surrounded by history that mattered. His son had been shaped by stability that the barn had provided, by watching his father fight for principles and build something meaningful from desperate circumstances. The barn breathed an evening air, its timbers solid and secure after years of careful restoration, its purpose transformed from tobacco curing to community gathering, its hidden cellar now serving as educational space rather than secret treasury. Thomas Whitmore's wealth had been found and used, his trust in whoever discovered it validated by Carter's choices, his legacy extended beyond family bloodlines into the realm of helping people who needed the kind of chance desperation had given Carter. As darkness settled over the property and people began leaving, Carter stood alone in the workshop thinking about the journey that had brought him here. The eviction notice that had started it all. The desperate bid at a county auction. The hidden cellar and the fortune that should have been impossible but wasn't. The battles fought and won against people who'd spent generations perfecting the art of taking what they wanted. The barn had given him more than shelter or wealth, it had given him purpose, had transformed his desperation into opportunity to help others experiencing similar struggles, had proved that sometimes the places you stumbled into through necessity held exactly what you needed even if you didn't know you needed it. Lucas joined him as the last visitors left, both of them standing in the space they'd transformed from condemned decay into living history. "Dad, do you ever think about what would have happened if someone else had bought the barn? If we'd missed the auction or if someone had outbid you?" Carter thought about this, about the razor-thin margin between finding the barn and remaining homeless, about the luck and timing that had led him to discover property no one else wanted. All the time. But I also think about how Thomas set this up. He hid wealth in a way that guaranteed only someone desperate would find it, only someone who actually needed shelter badly enough to buy a condemned building. That was an accident. That was intention. They walked through the barn turning off lights, securing spaces that had been transformed through years of work from dangerous structure to community resource. The building stood as monument to the idea that inheritance meant more than receiving, that legacy was built through choices about how to use what you'd been given, that desperate gambles sometimes led to places that honored both the desperation and the courage it took to try. The land had taken much from Carter, his wife to cancer, his stability to medical debt, years of struggling before finding the barn. But the land had also given back, security for Lucas, resources to help others, proof that standing for principles when standing was expensive had value that went beyond financial returns. 7 years had transformed an abandoned tobacco barn into living legacy, had changed a man facing eviction into someone who built security for his son while helping others avoid similar desperation, had shown that sometimes the most valuable inheritance wasn't money but the trust that someone would use money properly when they found it. The barn would stand long after Carter was gone, would continue serving and teaching, would remain proof that Thomas Whitmore's choice to hide wealth rather than see it wasted had been vindicated by someone who'd stumbled into that wealth through desperation and had chosen to honor the trust placed in whoever was brave enough or broken enough to discover what 60 years of darkness had protected. As Carter locked the barn and walked with Lucas toward the house they'd built from renovation of the second floor, both of them heading home through darkness that felt comfortable now, he felt the weight of 7 years settle into something approaching peace. The journey from eviction to foundation, From poverty to stewardship, from desperation to purpose, it had been earned through courage and luck and stubborn refusal to surrender when surrender would have been easier. Thomas Whitmore had accumulated a fortune and died alone protecting it. Carter had found that fortune and built a life that honored both the wealth and the principles that had led Thomas to hide it. The difference between them wasn't resources or intelligence but understanding that true legacy lay in what you built rather than what you protected. That inheritance mattered most when it transformed receivers into builders rather than mere possessors. The barn stood in darkness now, its archives secured, its workshop spaces quiet until tomorrow brought new projects and purposes. But it breathed still, the timbers settling with sounds like whispered conversation, the land remembering everything that had happened here across a century of tobacco and transformation, the whole property serving as proof that desperate people who tried impossible things sometimes got rewarded with chances to become who they were meant to be. 15 years passed like seasons across the tobacco fields that had been reclaimed by forest, each one leaving its mark on the barn the way time shapes all things built by human hands. Carter watched Lucas grow from the 7-year-old boy who'd slept in a condemned building to a 22-year-old man graduating with a degree in historic preservation. His thesis focused on adaptive reuse of agricultural structures in post-tobacco economies. The barn had transformed with them. What had been desperate shelter was now the Riverside Heritage Center, a registered historic property that drew visitors from across the state. The community workshops operated at capacity, hosting 15 small businesses and craftspeople who couldn't afford commercial rent but who added vitality to a county that had been slowly dying as agriculture moved elsewhere. The archive had grown to include not just Thomas Whitmore's records but donated materials from dozens of families documenting rural life across a century of change. Carter had used the foundation carefully, investing most of it in trusts and endowments that would outlive him, keeping enough for security but not for luxury. He'd bought the house next to the barn property, modest but solid, with Lucas's childhood artwork still visible in the room that had been his before college. He'd continued working construction when projects interested him, had served on the County Historical Commission, had shown up for the small commitments that made rural communities function when people cared enough to stay. The wealth had changed his circumstances but not his identity. He was still Carter Hayes, single father who'd bought a foreclosed barn out of desperation, who'd found fortune and chosen to use it for more than personal enrichment. The money made it possible to help others, but the decision to help, to honor Thomas Whitmore's trust by being better than the family members Thomas had excluded, that was the part Carter was proud of. Margaret Brennan's stories had become part of the archive, her voice preserved in recordings that explained tobacco farming to generations who would never see the crop growing in fields. She died believing the barn honored Thomas's memory better than any Whitmore descendant could have, believing that Carter had proven worthy of the trust Thomas placed in whoever was desperate enough to discover what he'd hidden. Douglas Whitmore had visited occasionally over the years, his relationship with Carter evolving from antagonist to something approaching friendship founded on shared understanding of Thomas's complicated legacy. Douglas was 80 now, moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body remembered too many years, or the expression of a man who'd made peace with choices he couldn't change. On a cool October afternoon, Douglas arrived at the barn carrying a box of documents he'd finally decided to share. Family letters, photographs, business records that added context to Thomas's decisions and the family conflicts that had shaped everything. "I've been holding on to these for 60 years, Douglas said, settling into a chair in the archive room. Didn't want to acknowledge what they revealed about my father and grandfather, about the reasons Thomas excluded us from inheritance. But I'm 80 years old, and my children deserve to know their actual history rather than the version I've been telling myself." The documents revealed a family more complicated than the simple narrative of stubborn patriarch excluding wasteful heirs. Thomas's son Douglas Sr. had struggled with alcohol, had made business decisions that cost the tobacco operation substantial money, had treated workers with cruelty that contradicted everything Thomas believed about fair labor practices. Thomas's letters to his son showed a father trying desperately to teach different values, expressing love through correction that Douglas Sr. experienced only as criticism. "My grandfather wasn't just wasteful," Douglas said quietly. "He was abusive to workers, embezzled from the company, made choices that could have destroyed everything Thomas built." Thomas gave him chance after chance, finally realized that continuing to enable him was betraying the workers and the business. Excluding him from the will wasn't about being stubborn, it was about protecting people who depended on fair treatment. The revelation reframed everything Carter had understood about the inheritance dispute. Thomas hadn't hidden wealth out of simple stubbornness but out of recognition that giving it to family who'd proven untrustworthy would harm people beyond just the family. The choice to let the property go to foreclosure rather than be inherited by Douglas Sr. was choosing workers' dignity over family loyalty. I spent my life resenting Thomas for excluding us, trying to reclaim what I thought we deserved, Douglas continued. Never questioned whether my father's behavior had earned exclusion, never examined whether I'd inherited the same traits that made Thomas decide we couldn't be trusted. Watching you build something meaningful with resources Thomas protected, it forced me to reckon with whether we would have done the same or would have proven Thomas right by wasting everything he'd hidden. Carter thought about his own father, who'd died when Carter was young, who'd left lessons about work ethic and integrity that Carter had carried into adulthood. The idea of being specifically excluded from inheritance, of having a parent judge you unworthy, carried pain that went beyond money into the realm of fundamental rejection. Thomas loved his son, Carter said carefully. The letters make that clear. But he loved what he'd built and the people who depended on it more than he loved the idea of family inheritance at any cost. That's a hard choice, but maybe it's the right one when family proves they'll cause harm. Douglas nodded slowly, accepting truth that had taken 80 years to fully acknowledge. My father died broken, bitter, blaming Thomas for his failures. I almost followed the same path, spent decades pursuing money I wasn't entitled to, nearly died still resenting Thomas's judgment. But these past 15 years, watching what you've built here, they taught me that Thomas was right. Some people deserve inheritance, and some people need to be protected from it. After Douglas left, Carter donated the documents to the archive, ensuring that future researchers would have access to the full complexity of Thomas Whitmore's story rather than simplified versions that made him either hero or villain. The truth was Messier, a man who'd built success through fair labor practices, who'd tried to teach his son better values, who'd finally made the hard choice to exclude family rather than betray principles. Lucas had spent summers during college working at the barn, had developed his thesis around the building's transformation from agricultural structure to community resource. His academic work had attracted attention from preservation organizations and grant-making foundations, had established him as someone who understood how to honor history while creating contemporary utility. I want to do this professionally, Lucas told Carter one evening while they worked on minor repairs to the barn's exterior. Help other communities figure out how to preserve agricultural buildings as something more than museums, show that historic structures can serve present needs without destroying what makes them historically significant. His passion for the work reminded Carter of Thomas's dedication to quality tobacco curing, of the pride his predecessor had taken in running operations that met standards others ignored. The stubborn insistence on doing things properly had skipped a generation through Douglas Sr. but had found expression in Lucas's commitment to preservation that honored both history and function. On a warm evening in late May, 20 years after Carter had bought the barn at auction, they held what had become the Heritage Center's signature event. The Whitmore Legacy Gathering, a day when the barn opened to the community, when families who'd been helped by the foundation shared their stories, when students displayed research about tobacco history and rural economic transformation. Douglas Whitmore attended, bringing his children and grandchildren, introducing them to Carter and Lucas with pride rather than resentment. The shift in their family's relationship with Thomas's legacy was visible in how Douglas's grandchildren engaged with the archive, asking questions about their great-great-grandfather's business practices, wanting to understand the full truth rather than sanitized versions. "You've done something remarkable here," Douglas said to Carter as evening settled over the property. "Turned a condemned building into living history, used Thomas's hidden wealth to help people the way Thomas helped his workers. My family spent 60 years trying to claim inheritance we didn't deserve. You spent 20 years building legacy that honors what Thomas actually valued." After the gathering ended, Carter stood alone in the barn's main space, looking at timbers he'd stabilized and preserved, at floors he'd restored, at spaces that had been transformed from dangerous decay to purposeful vitality. The building had been his salvation and his teacher, had given him shelter when he had nowhere else, and had shown him over 2 decades what it meant to build something that mattered beyond one family's security. He thought about his wife, dead now 18 years, about the medical debt and grief that had brought him to the foreclosure auction. She'd died believing he would be okay, would raise Lucas well, would find some way to survive the chaos her death created. He hadn't just survived, he'd built a life that honored her hope for them, had shown Lucas that desperate circumstances could lead to places that made sense of the suffering that preceded them. Lucas joined him as darkness completed its claim on the day, both of them comfortable in the silence that had developed through 20 years of shared work on the barn. He was leaving in 2 months for a fellowship with a national preservation organization, pursuing career opportunities that would take him beyond North Carolina but that were rooted in everything the barn had taught him. "I'm going to miss this place," Lucas said quietly. "Not just the building but what it represents. The way you fought for it when everyone said to sell, the way you built something that helped people instead of just banking money, the way standing for things actually shaped who I became. You'll carry it with you," Carter said with certainty. "The barn gave you more than just stable childhood, it taught you that buildings have purposes beyond their original design, that history matters most when it serves present needs, that inheritance is obligation as much as gift. Those lessons work anywhere you apply them." They stood together as stars appeared in patterns that had looked down on this land before the barn was built, before Thomas Whitmore had grown tobacco, before any of the human struggles that had shaped this place. The same stars would witness whatever came next, would look down on the barn long after Carter and Lucas were gone. The building breathed in the night air, its timbers solid and secure after 2 decades of careful stewardship, its purpose transformed but its essential character preserved. Thomas Whitmore's wealth had been found and used, his trust in whoever discovered it validated by Carter's choices, his complicated legacy extended beyond family bloodlines into realm of helping people who needed chances desperation had given Carter. Carter thought about the journey that had brought him here, the eviction notice that had started everything, the impossible bid on property no one wanted, the hidden cellar and the fortune it contained, the battles against people who'd spent generations perfecting the art of taking what they wanted through legal pressure. The barn had given him more than shelter or wealth, it had given him purpose that went beyond survival into the realm of building something that would outlast him. The foundation had helped 93 families over 20 years, had prevented evictions and medical bankruptcies for people experiencing the same desperation that had driven Carter to the foreclosure auction. The work operated through quiet referrals, deliberately avoided publicity that would attract those gaming the system. Each family helped represented Carter's recognition that his discovery had been luck as much as merit, that honoring Thomas's trust meant sharing the good fortune that desperation had stumbled into. On a cool morning in early autumn, 21 years after buying the barn, Carter received unexpected news. Douglas Whitmore had died peacefully at 81, his will explicitly stating that any remaining Whitmore family claims to the Riverside property were renounced in perpetuity. More surprisingly, Douglas had left his own estate, modest but meaningful, to the Heritage Center's endowment, asking that it be used to fund preservation of other agricultural buildings. The gesture was Douglas's final reconciliation with Thomas's judgment, his acknowledgement that Carter had proven worthy of trust the Whitmore family hadn't earned. His children attended a small memorial at the barn, sharing stories about how their father had changed in his final years, had finally made peace with family history that had shaped him in ways he'd only understood late in life. "Dad spent 60 years angry about being excluded," Douglas's daughter said during the gathering. "The last 15, he spent grateful that someone like Carter found what Thomas hid, that the wealth went to someone who built something meaningful instead of just fought over ownership. He died believing Thomas's choice had been vindicated." As seasons turned and years accumulated, Carter watched the barn become less his project and more the community's inheritance. Lucas returned regularly, brought colleagues interested in adaptive reuse, used the building as case study in preservation work that honored history while creating utility. The Heritage Center operated independently now, managed by a board that ensured its mission continued regardless of Carter's involvement. But Carter still came to the barn most evenings, walked through spaces he'd stabilized and restored, felt the satisfaction of work that had transformed condemnation into preservation. The building stood as monument to the idea that desperate gambles sometimes led to places that made sense of the desperation, that inheritance carried obligations extending beyond simple ownership into moral duty to use well what you'd been given. On a quiet evening in late spring, 25 years after the foreclosure auction that had changed everything, Carter stood at the barn's entrance watching sunset paint the timbers in colors that made the wood look alive. Lucas was there, home for a visit, both of them working on plans for the barn's next phase: expanded programming, additional archive space, partnerships with universities studying rural transformation. The land had changed around them, forest reclaiming fields that had once grown tobacco, the industry that had built Thomas's fortune now mostly memory preserved in archives and stories. But the barn remained, adapted and purposeful, serving needs that Thomas couldn't have anticipated but would have recognized as worthy continuation of his commitment to building things that mattered. Carter thought about the note Thomas had left in the cellar, about the trust placed in whoever was desperate enough to find it. 25 years of stewardship had proven Carter worthy of that trust, had transformed discovered wealth into lasting legacy that helped others while honoring the labor that had created the fortune. Thomas had died alone protecting resources from family he couldn't trust. Carter had lived building community from those resources, showing that sometimes the greatest inheritance wasn't what you received but what you chose to create with what you'd been given. The barn stood in evening light, its shadow stretching across land that had seen generations of struggle and transformation, its timbers holding stories that would outlast anyone currently alive. Thomas Whitmore's legacy had been preserved not through family inheritance but through strangers' choice to honor principles over profit, to build rather than simply possess. As darkness settled and Carter locked the barn for the night, walking with Lucas toward the house through familiar paths, he felt the weight of 25 years settle into something approaching completion. Not ending, because the work would continue, the Heritage Center would operate, the foundation would help families, the barn would stand teaching lessons about preservation and purpose. But closure on the journey that had started with desperation and led through discovery to this moment of quiet triumph. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles, witnessing the slow work of barns being saved and wealth being shared and families choosing to build rather than fight. Thomas Whitmore had hidden a fortune believing someone worthy would find it. Carter Hayes had proven worthy not through finding it but through 25 years of choices about what to build with what desperation had discovered. The land remembered everything: the tobacco fields, the hidden cellar, the battles fought and the peace finally achieved. It had shaped Carter and Lucas, had taken their labor and given back purpose, had proved that sometimes the places you stumbled into through necessity held exactly what you needed even if you didn't know you needed it until years of living there revealed it. The barn breathed in darkness, its archives secured, its community spaces quiet until tomorrow brought new purposes. It stood as Thomas Whitmore's truest legacy, not the wealth he'd accumulated but the trust he'd placed in whoever would find it, the hope that someone would use it better than excluded family members would have. Carter had honored that hope through choices that transformed inheritance into legacy, that showed Lucas what standing for things actually required. 25 years had changed a condemned tobacco barn into a living monument to the idea that desperate people who tried impossible things sometimes got rewarded with chances to build lives that honored both the desperation and the courage it took to try. The journey from eviction to foundation, from poverty to stewardship, from discovery to legacy, it had been earned through luck and stubbornness and the recognition that wealth mattered most when it served purposes beyond mere possession. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.